What? Yeah.
Okay. Welcome to the Philosophy for the Public workshop. Hi! This project started something like 6 months ago. We started preparing for it. And we wanted to reach out for people, asking them to think about philosophy, to debate philosophy as something simple, not very complex, as part of your everyday life, as part of your questions that you think about. And we gained the support of a lot of people on campus. We got the support of a lot of professors in the philosophy department. We got the support of the chair of the department, Professor Fensham, and we got the support of the dean, Professor Nathaniel Bowditch. I'm using the word Nate because he's so friendly to you. He'll be doing the introduction today. Basically, the workshop will be 2 parts. We will have a lecture of 1 hour, and then we will have a debate. But today we're doing just the introduction. We don't expect much of a debate, but you can discuss with us. And next time we're starting with the big question, does God exist? But Professor Bowditch today is giving us the introduction. Just welcome him with me.
All right, well, thank you very much, all of you guys, for being here. This is great. You don't know this maybe, but philosophers don't often get the chance to do this. Most of the time, philosophers talk to other philosophers, and it's pretty boring as a result, because we all know pretty much what we're talking about. We talk about the same things, and we write papers that we share with each other, and it's a very small world. And the thing that's frustrating, the reason we love teaching, and the reason we love things like this, is we get to be with interested people who make us think about what we do in interesting new ways. So every time I get to sit with people, smart, interested people, I end up happier. I end up learning all kinds of things I hadn't thought about. So I'm thanking you for this opportunity. It's great for me. And I know my colleagues in the philosophy department, getting the chance to sit in a room full of interested people who aren't getting paid for it and aren't doing it for a class that they have to do, or maybe they are, but they don't tell me. This is, okay, there's someone back there doing it for a class. But I mean, this is a great thing. So thank you very much for coming out. I really appreciate it. I also want to thank the Philosophy Club. I've been at AUC now, this is my 11th year. I've been here in Cairo. And my first office was in the old Falaki building, which isn't around anymore. Remember that ugly building that kind of smelled like shoes when you went inside? And, you know, I've loved being down here. I loved teaching philosophy here. And the AUC has been fantastic to me. And so to get to be here, to come back down to this campus, to get to be in this community is a tremendous opportunity. And the Philosophy Club and the students at AUC, we've always been a small club. Everyone in this room knows that in Egypt, your parents don't say, I want you to grow up and be a philosopher. Right? No. Come on, Mohandas, yalla, right? But when you do find a student who's brave enough and passionate enough, or a parent, or someone walking in off the street, it's a great joy. And so the philosophy students at AUC, there's not that many of them, but they're passionate and they work hard and they love what they do and they do great work. And they give us all the opportunity to sit together. So we should thank them for doing such a good job. We're very lucky. Thank you. All right, so I'm here to begin this series, and I accepted the very generous offer to give this talk. And they said, well, will you start it? And I said, well, I don't know. I'm not the most qualified. But they said, oh, please. And so, okay, fine, I'll do it. And I said, what's it about? And I don't really remember what they said, but I was going to do it anyways because I thought it would be nice and fun, and I like coming down. And, well, of course, then I actually have to write and think about what I'm going to say. And the question I'm supposed to talk about is, what is philosophy and how does it contribute to the public good? Now that is possibly, maybe not the hardest, but one of the hardest questions that a philosopher ever has to answer. It's impossible. So I immediately, once I started thinking about actually working on this, I get very panicked. I'd say, what is philosophy? It's one of the hardest questions in the history of philosophy. So one of the things today I'm going to argue for, I'm going to try and show you, is that this question is a philosophical question. It's not a scientific question. It's not an artistic question, maybe in certain ways. This is a philosophical question. What is philosophy? So we'll work on what that means. I am not going to define philosophy. If anyone wanted a definition of philosophy tonight, they should get out their phone and text, type in Wikipedia, what is philosophy, get the answer, and khalas. I'm not going to give you a definition, okay? And how I'm supposed to show that it contributes to the public good. Okay, who here in this room is confident they know what the public good is? Or what, yeah, right? So now I don't know what philosophy is exactly, and I don't know what the public good is, and I'm here to tell you about them. So this is the life of a philosopher. This is what we do every day. And it's good for you if it's uncomfortable. So my talk is going to have two parts. First, and I'm going to try to tell you some ways to think about this question, what is philosophy? I'm not going to define it, but I'm going to try to show you something about what philosophy is, the kinds of questions philosophers ask, the kinds of things they think about, and what it means to do philosophy, right? And why it might be a worthwhile and useful thing for you to do, okay? And by the end of this talk, I hope that you understand why I'm not going to try and define philosophy. That's not something I can do for you. I hope you can make sense of that. And I hope that when I say that I can't define it for you, you won't find that unsatisfying. You'll say, okay, I get it. So, when I was a young philosophy student many years ago at the University of California, Berkeley, and I just met my now wife, and I would ask philosophers in books, and I would ask my professors, I'd say, what is philosophy? And I would get different kinds of answers, and they weren't usually that helpful. So one answer is, that really everyone likes is, philosophia. Look at the word, and that will tell you what philosophy is. Philo, love, right? Sophia, wisdom. Philosophy, love of wisdom. That sounds great, but it doesn't really tell you much about what philosophy is, does it? Right? Think of how many different ways you can love wisdom. I mean, arguably, looking at great art, admiring beautiful music, that's a way of loving wisdom, right? Listening to someone who has had a lifetime of experience getting through the world in their own way. That's a kind of loving to wisdom, right? So how does saying love of wisdom? It's cool, right? But it doesn't really say much about what philosophy actually is. So maybe it's like, philosophy, the way people use it in everyday life, maybe that's what philosophy means, and so I could learn. So there's questions like, his philosophy of banking. Well, no, that's not right. Or his philosophy of, how to find a good date. No, that's not what I mean. It's not like a cat. When I say philosophy and what I'm going to try and do with you today, I don't mean like a little knack or like a little particular motto or skill that you have. It's more than that. It's much more complicated. So then I would go to books, where many of my heroes live in books. And I would look into the history of philosophy, and I'd say, okay, maybe they can define it for me. So some definitions of philosophy are kind of weird, and they look like they exclude from philosophy everything other than their own work, and you'll see what I mean. So one of my heroes, and I'll show you his picture later on, this guy named Ludwig Wittgenstein. This is how he defines philosophy. Philosophy is a battle against the bewitchment of our intelligence by the means of language. You got that, right? So we can all go home? No. Or, this is another one that's even more clear than that one. Philosophy is, quote, the expressly accomplished correspondence which speaks insofar as it considers the appeal of being. Right? Easy. So, so that effort to go and look in the history of philosophy to get it, that didn't work either. So I would ask my professor. I had a great, famous professor named Barry Stroud who worked on skepticism. Really interesting guy, the most boring lecturer of all time, but he was brilliant. So I asked him this question. We used to have wine and cheese after philosophy talks, if you can imagine that. And I said, so what's philosophy? And he said, well, when one feels the need to ask this question, it's generally best to lie down until the feeling passes. So I didn't know what this meant exactly, But I actually think it's not a bad idea. There are days when that's my answer to. But I'm going to try, having said all those silly things, I'm going to try and say something about what I think, one way to answer this question. So let's see if my clicker works here. Okay, we have our definitions. I like that bottom one of Heidegger's, right? How about this? Doing philosophy is like riding a bicycle or playing music. Huh? Right? Or as Wittgenstein, again, he's up here, philosophy is not a body of doctrine, but an activity. So what do I mean when I say philosophy is like riding a bicycle? It certainly doesn't seem like it. Who here rides a bicycle? Or knows how to ride a bicycle? Okay, so lots of you. Who here plays music? I also do bicycle, right? All right, so if I asked one of you, can you define how to ride a bicycle? Would you be able to? No. You would be able to? Or no, you wouldn't be able to? You wouldn't. How about this? Who plays music again? If someone said, define playing music for me. So what would you, if someone asked you that, you'd have to say something back besides no. So how would you answer them? Well, I can't define bike riding, but I can teach you. I can show you how people do it, right? Or playing music. Well, you want to know how to play music? Pick up the oud. There's a lot of strings. Get to it, right? I mean, how else are you? So I'm going to say philosophy is actually kind of like that. If you want to understand what philosophy is, just like what music is, you've got to do it, right? So today what I want to show you is a little teeny bit about what philosophers do. Right? And so you'll watch me do it a teeny bit. And there's a few times I'm not even going to have my paper at all and I'm going to wing it. And who knows what's going to happen. And it's kind of like bike riding, right? Or playing music when you improvise. Anyone here plays jazz music, right? Improvising. I don't know what's going to happen. I hope it works out. Philosophy's got some of that too. Okay? So, we'll take maybe, just like with bike riding, if you tried to teach me to ride a bike in an hour and I didn't know how to ride, would I be good at the end of an hour? No. But if I could learn to roll a few meters or to play a few notes, that would be a good hour. So hopefully it's something like that. So, instead of telling you what philosophy is, I'm going to show you what it is a little bit. So, one way to do that is to show you 4 features or 4 things about philosophy that might be useful to think about it. So one thing you could say about philosophy is history or tradition. Okay? This is important to me. One way to think of it is as a series of histories and traditions reaching back over thousands of years all over the world. People have been philosophizing, right? Now, it might seem odd from where we're sitting now to think this, that 1,000, 2,000 years ago, people were doing something like what we're doing in this room together right now. Yeah. And then that's one of the brilliant things about philosophy. When you're doing it, you're part of a tradition, just like with music. You learn from the past. So, by the way, this is what you hear often in my classrooms. Many philosophers say, philosophy begins with Socrates, right? And they wouldn't be wrong. But you would say this, philosophy is histories and traditions. One history of philosophy begins with Socrates. Well, actually, it doesn't. Of course, he didn't come out of nowhere. There were people before him in Greece and Turkey and Italy that's doing these things. But that's one tradition. And it's really important to remember there are other traditions. So in Indian philosophy, it was formalized well before ancient Greek philosophy, which we now call the roots of Western philosophy. Indian philosophers were creating text, creating tradition, creating doctrine as far back as 1000 BCE. The earliest philosophical compositions in the world. So, Jainism, Buddhism, yoga, and various others. And some have survived, some haven't, right? So we're talking 3,000 years of philosophy in India. Or you go to China. Confucianism, for example, developed during, in say, 551, around 550 BC. And Confucius talks about ethics, politics, personal growth, morality, social relationships, justice, traditionalism, sincerity, kind of the same stuff we're worrying about now, right? So again, there are these traditions. Here we are in Cairo, Al-Azhar, right? Islamic philosophy. 9th century on the Roman calendar flourished, right? The Islamic Golden Age went to about the 12th century. Huge effect on Europe. While Islamic philosophy was flourishing in this part of the world, what was going on in Europe? Does anyone know? The Dark Ages, right? So we have a story about how there's the civilized and the uncivilized, but of course stories aren't that simple. And philosophy was rich and flourishing, and I have colleagues in my philosophy department at AUC who study and devote their lives to the study of Islamic philosophy, to Averroes ibn Rushd, as he's called. And I mean, you guys know, this is a great resource. But I myself grew up, I didn't grow up in Cairo, I grew up in Boston and Berkeley and Baltimore, lots of B's, right? And so I grew up thinking of Socrates as the father of my tradition, but it's only one. And I think it's important to keep that in mind. So I didn't want to do it because it's kind of annoying. But if you wanted to know what Western philosophy was, you'd Wikipedia it and you'd go to this link. And you'd get a story, right? And it would be a cool story. And it would start with these guys called the pre-Socratics, or maybe there'd be mention of Homer, 1000 BC. And then there'd be the pre-Socratics, these guys who lived mostly in what we now call Turkey, and who lived in the southern part of Italy, who came and traveled. There was all kinds of movement. You know, philosophy grows when people from different places come together, like great art, by the way, right? And music. So the coming together of cultures from different places and different ideas come together in ancient Greece. And out of that emerges someone like Socrates and his philosophy. And then there's a tradition of the teacher and the student. And who is Socrates' great student? Plato. That's how we know of him. Did Socrates write anything as far as we know? No. So interestingly, part of that tradition is oral. Again, think about traditions all over the world. They're not all just written down in books. And then we say, okay, so then who came after? There's Plato, the great Plato, who wrote his monstrous Republic, which a philosophy of everything, right? After him, who was his student, his great student? Aristotle, exactly. So you guys already know this story, right? This history. And it comes through when we go into the Christian era and the great medieval philosophers. And then we have the sort of early modern period come along, and people like Descartes who start to separate religion and philosophy, right? And we enter what we think of as some sense the modern world, though I don't know why that makes it modern, right? And then we have stories of philosophers and religion struggling, and then Kant comes along and upends the whole thing, and the relationship with human being and nature is called into doubt. Well, it's great, and it's very exciting. It is only one tradition, and you can't know what philosophy is just from reading the Wikipedia page about the history of Western philosophy. There's more to it than just that. So part of philosophy is history and tradition, an essential part of it. There are some philosophers who think actually that the whole of philosophy is just rereading the history of philosophy. I don't think it's just that. So then, what's the second thing you can say about what philosophy is? Well, another way to think of it that is tied to these histories and traditions is philosophy is problems. Okay? Now, I don't want you to take notes or try and remember these or write them down. There's a ton of them. But what kinds of problems do philosophers worry about? Well, what does it mean to be a good person? How should I live my life? Why should I do what is right if I can get away with doing what's wrong? Is there anything wrong with lying? Is it better to be alive than dead? What happens after one dies? Does God exist? Does it matter that God exists? What is the relationship between God and man? Well, why is there only one God? What proof do I have that God exists? What proof do I have that anything exists? What proof do I have that I exist? What proof do I have that other people exist? If other people exist, do I have to treat them in any particular way? Is there a best way for people to live together? Is one political system better than another? Does the political state have the right to kill people? Why is killing people wrong? Is killing animals wrong? Why should I care about the environment? Do I owe the world anything? Does the world owe me anything? Is anything in the world good? Is anything in the world beautiful? What makes something beautiful? What makes something art? Is art beautiful? Is mathematics beautiful? What is mathematics? Why does 1 + 1 = 2? Will 1 + 1 = 2 tomorrow? Will the sun rise tomorrow? How do I know the sun exists? Can I trust the senses that I use to know that the sun exists? Can I trust anything? Can I know anything? All right. So that's a ridiculous list of questions. Okay? Now, what do these questions have in common that makes them all philosophical questions? Well, I don't know. When you're standing in front of some beautiful piece of art, and you know it's beautiful, is it beautiful and you know it? So that's not intangible, right? But I know you're right. You're onto something.
It's subjective.
Do you think that murder being bad is subjective?
Yeah.
You do. Okay. Does everyone in the room think that whether or not murder is right or wrong is subjective? It's up to you. Yeah. Some do, some don't. So we already have a problem.
Yes.
All right. So yeah, I mean, this is one. They're not. You don't quite know what to do with them. What else do they have in common? They're not agreed upon, that's for sure. And you'd think one of the interesting things is by now, depending on how you count the history of philosophy, 2,000-3,000 years, you think a bunch of smart people worrying about these questions, you'd think by now we'd make a little progress. Have we? Interesting, right? Have we made progress with scientific questions? Yeah. Absolutely. Now, we haven't always made the right choices with what to do with science, but that's a different matter. Scientific knowledge itself is awesome, and it's grown exponentially over the decades and centuries. Philosophical knowledge, I'm not sure how much better we're doing now than Socrates was doing then. So yeah, what else do these questions have in common? They all have something to do with human beings. Interesting. So, will the sun rise tomorrow? Does that have to do with human beings? Okay, so you're right. It's close. A lot of them have to do with human beings. And there are philosophers who've said that all of these questions, the way we think about them, have to do with human beings. For example, Kant would say that. You can't think a question about anything that isn't in some sense shaped by your being a human being. Yeah, you were going to say?
Yeah, maybe consciousness would be better suited than a human being.
Consciousness. Okay, philosophical question. What is consciousness? Right? It's another one of these, and we all know what it is, right? One of the interesting things about this list of questions, you guys mind if I stand up? I get bored sitting down. I can't help it. So one of the things that's interesting to note about this list of questions, right, is that in one sense, they're all pretty obvious. They're all pretty simple. Most of us have an opinion, right, Oh, I know. Yeah, sure. Killing's wrong. Oh, killing. There's no such thing as killing being bad, really. It's just subjective. I know that. Right? So in a sense, we all have these opinions, and we think we know the answers, and it's all pretty straightforward, and yet figuring out how to answer these questions, even how to think about them, is immensely difficult. And one of the things that philosophy does to you over and over and over is it makes something simple that looks simple. Turns out it's much, much more complicated than we thought. And in fact, I think I have a quote somewhere here about this. Let's see if I can find it here. Is it on here? No. I have a quote here. That's a good one. This is Bertrand Russell. Okay? Nice little passage. The point of philosophy is to start with something so simple as to not seem worth even talking about, and to end up with something so paradoxical that no one will believe it. Now, that's a little silly, but there's something right about that. I mean, what you're doing in philosophy constantly is looking at everyday life, normal, mundane, everyday things, and the closer you look, the more complicated, the more troubling, the more difficult they get. And so, is philosophy easy? No. It's just the opposite. It makes the easy complicated. But remember, I talked about this doing part of philosophy, like riding a bike. Learning to do that, and over, practicing, looking at the simple and seeing its complexity and allowing yourself to be confused and then work on it. That exercise. And again, what does this talk about? How does it contribute to the public good? Think about this idea of exercises, of learning to do something, practicing it, and how that might be ultimately for the public good. All right. So, one way to think of about what a philosopher is then is, you might say, the philosopher is like a little brother or sister. Now, what do little brothers and sisters always do when they ask you a question and you give an answer, and what do they say? Yeah. Okay, so yeah, it's sunny outside, so you don't need an umbrella. Why is it sunny outside? Well, because the sun's shining and it's in its orbit around the Earth. We're orbiting around it, and our Earth's rotation is such that the sun... Why? Why are we spinning like that? Because the way that the planetary motion is governed by the laws of physics, and after the Big Bang, everything was distributed and coalesced the way that it did. Why? Right? So in a way, what philosophy is, it's like that. And in a way, it's annoying. We're going to talk later. We're going to talk about Socrates. Anyone know one of his nicknames? Yes?
Mr. Y.
Huh? Mr. Y. Okay, that's good. I have not heard that one, but that could be his nickname. One of his nicknames was the Gadfly. Right? Kind of like, when you go, anyone here know horses? You know those flies that go around horses? Right? And what does the horse try and do? The horse hates it, right? And they're like, little tail, right? Shaking its head. Socrates, he said, I'm like that. I'm a gadfly. Like your little brother or sister, right? But that's really important. Again, I want to come back to this when we're talking about the public good. Is the gadfly popular? Do people like to hang out with the gadfly? No. Right? It's just the same reason you want to go hang out with your friends instead of your little sister or brother. But the gadfly is a really important person. That character in our lives and in our communities and in our societies plays a really important role. So keep that in mind. So we talked about history and tradition, and we talked about problems. So what else is there to philosophy? How am I doing on time? Fine, right? I can just cruise for a while, time-wise. Thank you. Well, one way to think of it as... Sorry, before I keep going. All those questions I just asked you, for anyone who wants to be organized, philosophers like to be organized because so much of what's going on in their head is a mess. So they take all those questions, those 3 slides of questions, and they group them into different categories, right? And so if we went back to those questions, we would be able to, maybe artificially a little bit, take those questions and put them into these groups. So metaphysics, the study of the nature of reality in the universe, right? So, does the sun exist? Or does God exist? Right. So, or, right? The nature of physics. Why do we have physics? Right? Why does anything mean any, right? So there are these big questions, and there's questions about knowing things, as opposed to the way, I mean, you could have all kinds of questions about, you could prove that God exists, right? But then you wouldn't really know much about God, maybe. So questions about God, there's questions about existence and reality, but there's also questions about how do we know anything? So even if there is a world out there, how do I know that it looks like it looks to me? I'm sitting here looking at all of you sitting there, and you're looking at me, this guy in a suit and a white shirt talking to you. Looks like that's all the proof I need. How do we know we're seeing the same kind of thing? Right? We'll come back to this, right? So all those kinds of questions. And then logic. Earlier I said 1 + 1 is 2. That's so obvious and so true. It's so easy and comfortable. But why is 1 + 1 2? It's actually kind of a really, really difficult question. There's no two identical. How do you know that? So this is the problem, right? So, and then there's ethics. That's the next sort of category, if you wanted to throw questions into a category. And these are questions about right and wrong, value, and how you should live your life. And this is what Socrates obsessed on. We'll talk about him a little bit later. Right? So some of those things, what's wrong with killing? I mean, if you might think, oh, it's just bad, it's horrible. Huh. Why? Right? And you're not even supposed to ask that, maybe. Again, philosophers are troublemakers. But it's an okay question to ask as far as, why is it wrong to kill? Is it? Right? And then there's questions about politics. Again, we're talking about the public good. It's one of our themes. What's the right way for people to live together? What is a state, and what is the state's responsibility? How does a government relate to individuals? What are your rights? What are your responsibilities as a citizen? Right? And there's no, you notice there's not any fact that's going to answer that question. We got to figure that out. Who can figure that out? Who's the only people who can answer these questions about ethics, say, or about politics? Who? Us? Is a physicist any better at answering that question than you? No. So again, there's this special nature of these questions. And then, of course, aesthetics. I talked about this, right? What makes something beautiful? We all know. I mean, I have children. I have my best friend and my wife, right? I've seen beautiful art. I've heard music that's made me cry regularly, actually. It's beautiful. Why on earth? What makes it beautiful? It really matters to us, but we don't know the answer. So these are areas of philosophical investigation. All right. I already read this quote. I love this quote. So the next thing then is, how do you deal with all those questions? The third way to think about what philosophy is, how you do philosophy, is you have these tools or these methods or these techniques. Right? We know we have problems. We have history. And then there are these problems, kinds of problems that emerge and that we've been worrying about. So how do you deal with them? Well, that history shows us that's one way. We can look back and see how other people dealt with the problems. And they used tools or techniques or methods, just like a musician when we study the history of music. How did they compose that? How did they execute it? What technique did they use? Well, philosophers have the same thing. We look back and we try and make sense of, how do I solve some of these problems? Right? So one of the things that we can do is we can use introspection. Anyone know what introspection is who's not a philosophy student at AUC? Yes, please. Yes. Okay, did everyone hear that? It's like internal research. Is that what you said? That's awesome. I haven't quite thought of it that, but that's a nice way to put it. Introspection is when you look inward. Right? You have all this stuff going on in your head right now. And it's different than what's going on in my head, I hope. Right? Each of us has our own perspective. He or she looks at the world and has experiences and thoughts that are unique. And the only person, I think, that has immediate access, who can get to what's going on in your head right now, is you. You have this special privileged access. And that act of looking in at your own mind, looking in at yourself, that's introspection. And you notice, who here has ever stood in really, I know we all have, stood in front of a mirror really, really closely and looked at your face? How does it feel? Creepy. It's kind of weird, isn't it? Yeah. No, I mean, you start getting really close and looking at your whole face and all the details and all that. It's weird. Well, introspection is weird too. When you stop rushing through and checking your email and checking your texts and Facebook, and you stop doing all that stuff, and you stop eating, and you don't get another Diet Pepsi, right? You just stop and think about what you're thinking about and how you're thinking about it. You look inward like looking in the mirror. It's very uncomfortable. But you can learn a lot from it, just like you can from looking in the mirror. The other thing, though, the other tool that you can use aside from looking inside is you can look out. I'm not stuck in my own head. One of the awesome things is I have a room full of friends with me, right? And we can talk so that I'm not trapped alone, at least as far as I know. It certainly doesn't seem like it. So there's this thing that we can do, and I can say, this is what I think, and you can say, really? Why do you think that? Just like my 13-year-old son says to me, why? Right? And then we can start talking in this activity that we can do together. But there's also this thing, reason. What happens when you and I are talking and we don't agree? And we got to figure something out. We want to come to a solution. We want to resolve. We want to make some sense of the world, and so that we can both say, yeah, that's right. We depend on reasons. So you and I have a disagreement about killing and whether it's just subjectively bad or objectively bad. Say, is it really right or wrong? So we'll start talking. And what are we going to do in our dialogue, in our conversation? You're going to give me your reasons. And what am I going to do? Give you my reasons. One way to think of philosophy is the giving of reasons. Right? And that back and forth, we're going to have to figure out whose reasons are better, right? And why? And that exercise is really, really hard. And there's no one right answer to it. It's not simple. But it's a really good skill, just like bike riding or playing music, to learn how to give reasons to each other. And the better you get at that, the more comfortable you're going to be when you're not sure. Right? You're not sure what the right answer is. You need to figure out what to do. Having a lot of practice at giving reasons to other people and listening to other people's reasons, you're going to be better at it. Just like if you ride a bike more, you'll be better at it. Practice giving reasons to each other. You'll get better at it. Now, I have this thing down here. Why did I put that there? Anyone know why I put that in there? Any guesses? And why I put a question mark? Yeah, please. Okay, maybe it doesn't depend on reasons. It's okay, but how is that a tool or a technique or a method? Yeah.
It's maybe a way to answer some of the questions.
Okay, it's a way to answer questions, but what kinds of questions? Yeah. Okay, it's a reference. Right, but I need it. Something. Why do I need it? Why can't I just only use reason? Yeah.
I think we use it to bridge the gaps that we can't find reason for.
Yeah. One of the things that happens in philosophy, in the giving of reasons, inevitably, and we can put this different ways, and atheists, by the way, this isn't just religious folks. There have been plenty of atheists in the history of philosophy who say things like, but at some point reason gives out. My spade is turned, right? I can't dig any deeper. I can't give any more reasons. It's just the way it is. Right? So there's this weird thing where all we have is reason, giving each other reasons, back and forth, trying to find the truth. But at some point, we've got to keep living our lives. We've got to make decisions. We've got to make commitments. Right? And they don't have to be, that faith doesn't have to be religious faith, but it's got to be something. For one of my heroes who I'm working, someday I'll finish my book on him, David Hume. He was not a religious man. But he ultimately thought, at the end of the day, you just keep reasoning until you're blue in the face. At some point, you want to solve a philosophical problem, leave your study, go have a beer, and play chess. Now, it's funny, but it's also true. You've got to live your life. So philosophy is constantly struggling with this. And one of the ways you deal with the struggle is faith of one kind or another. Now, this dude. After talking about methods and techniques and tools, why would I bring up this so cool looking dude? All right, well, Descartes' really useful because he shows a method. He reveals sort of what I'm talking about, a way of doing philosophy using tools and methods. He makes it really clear. Right? So he starts this book called The Meditations on First Philosophy. You guys have seen them, right? And it's a pretty short little book. It's only 6 meditations and 50 pages or something, right? And he says, all right, I'm really sick and tired of being confused. All my life, I've been trying to figure out what's really going on. I want to do science. I want to know what's real. I want to figure all this stuff out. But every time I try, I end up on some like rocky, shaky foundation, and I don't really know exactly if what my basic beliefs are true. And I want to start over. I want to start at the beginning on a certain foundation, like, a building. What's the word in Arabic? For the foundation. Yeah, right. I want that to be solid. Because if that's not solid, the whole thing, everything I think afterwards is a mess. Might fall down, bad gust of wind, right? So, how am I going to do this? So Descartes says, geez, man, I'm going to sit alone in my room by the fire in a dressing gown. I kind of like the way he sets the stage. He sits there by the fireplace. And he says, I'm going to look inward. I'm going to introspect. And I'm going to use reason and find out what I can know. And this is going to be my quest until I find something certain. And then I found the beginning of my foundation. Right? So he starts wondering, and he introspects, and he says, okay, how do I know I'm sitting here by the fire, holding up my piece of paper? Okay, cool. Yeah, all right, so I know I'm here. How do I know? Because I got my senses. I see the fire. I feel the warmth of the fire. I'm holding the paper, and it's kind of ruffling and stuff, right? And then he says, except there's this one problem. What's that problem that he brings up? Anyone remember? Yeah. I could be dreaming. Huh? Right? What do you mean I could be dreaming? What's the problem, Descartes? What, are you crazy? No, think about it. Everyone in this room. Who here has had a dream? Everyone, right? Now, when you wake up from the dream, you go, duh, that was just a dream. Or you go, thank goodness, that was just a dream. Whew. But while you're having the dream, it's real, right? That's why you wake up and go, oh, thank God. Because it was real when you were experiencing. And Descartes says, well, how do I know that right now, my sitting here in front of the fireplace with my cool jacket holding my paper, how do I know that that's not just a dream? Right? Well, we'll get there. So he says, maybe I'm dreaming. Okay. But even if I'm dreaming, I know the world exists. Right? I know. Now, by the way, do you think you can tell the difference between dreaming and being awake? You sure? You sure? So you've never had a nightmare? Well, then, when you had the nightmare, if you knew you were dreaming, you would have been like, it's a bad movie. But you didn't do that, did you? Right, so Descartes' onto this idea, by looking inside, you can find out things. And he discovers that what he thought he knew, I can just trust my senses. There's my hand. I'm fine. Ooh, I've had, and this is not a lie, I've had dreams of lecturing, of teaching classes. So, how do I know? Right? I think it's real. So he says, okay, well, how do I know then? Maybe I'm dreaming. Is there anything I can know for sure? And eventually he gets to your punchline, right? He says, well, I don't know if I'm sitting here necessarily, and I don't know if you're sitting there. Maybe you're not. What do I know? What do I know? What do I know? Is the sun out? No, well, maybe there's no sun. What do I know? And he says, Right. I doubt. And what does doubting prove? Right, I'm thinking, which means what? I'm doing something, it's me. I'm here, I'm existing. I don't know if anything I'm thinking is right. Say that again. Descartes doesn't know when he says, I think, right? Supposedly, therefore I am. He doesn't know whether what he is thinking about is true. But can he be wrong that he's thinking? No. So for him, and this is debatable, of course, it's philosophy, but for him, this is a way to find something absolutely certain. This is the beginning of a foundation for knowing something for certain. So what's cool is, I'm not saying Descartes' right. He might be crazy to worry about this. By the way, he gets even weirder. He wonders all kinds of stuff. He wonders if God exists. If God is tricking you, he could make you think this was all happening, right? Even if you don't think dreams are very powerful, God is, right? He could trick you about this easy. He could trick you. Who thinks God could make 2 + 2 = 5? All right, everyone with your hand up must not be a mathematician. And everyone with your hand down must not believe that God can do anything. So it's weird, right? So there's Descartes struggling back. Faith is always in the background. And one of the ways that Descartes ends up getting out of his doubt, out of his uncertainty, he uses reason, but underneath there's a kind of faith that anchors his figuring this out. So anyone who says that philosophy, the use of giving of reasons, is against religion doesn't know anything about the history of philosophy. Because if they did, they'd know that almost all of the history of philosophy is struggling with reason, faith, and everything else you can get your hands on to figure out problems. The antagonism, the fight of philosophy and religion is a pretty new invention, and hopefully it's a passing fad that we'll get over with. So there's Descartes showing you what it is for him to do philosophy with his problems and his concerns using his tools. Wittgenstein, one of my favorite philosopher pictures. Really cool guy. Really hard to make sense of. I just like the picture, so I put it up there. The last thing that I want to say about philosophy, right? I've talked about it being a set of traditions and histories. I've talked about it being a set of problems, in a way, a set of methods of dealing with the problems. Another thing I want to say is that philosophy is a way of life. And throughout history, when you go read those traditions and histories, you realize this. So a little later on, I'll talk a bit more about what I mean by saying philosophy is a way of life. So here's my definition. Let's see. I said I wasn't going to do, so I'm going to do my definition. I said I wouldn't do this, and I'm ready to get beaten up afterwards. Philosophy is a tradition rooted in history that deals with certain kinds of problems using tools and methods. And when you participate in this activity, you engage in a way of life. So that's my first try. I don't think it's really a definition. But we've just done some philosophy together, right? We thought through some traditions. We thought through some problems. We used some tools. We talked, and we came up with a working definition. Could we fix it? Could we argue about it? Absolutely. Could we change it? Yes. Could we modify it? Yes. Is it right? No. Is it wrong? No. Again, back to that list of weird philosophical questions. But this is an interesting starting point. Now, how much time have I used? I'll finish up quickly. One of the things I was supposed to talk about was how does philosophy contribute to the public good? And I want to get to that, but I want to make sure I don't screw up here. Yeah, okay. So, of course, I'm going to ask an obvious question. What's it going to be? What is the public good? You must be getting bored of that, right? It sounds like one of your siblings, right? And this is, of course, a philosophical question. There's no one answer to the question, right? There's no fact or set of facts that will answer the question what the public good is. And there's no way that you could like do a proof and have like 1 + 1 is 2. You know, this plus this equals the public good. Not going to happen. So what I instead want to do is I want to talk about, again, just start thinking about ways we can talk about the public good and how philosophy might be related to it, okay? So we're talking about goods. What kind of things are good? Just basic goods. Well, health and well-being. It's good, I think we all agree, to not be sick, to have enough food, to have shelter, to not be threatened, to not have your life at risk. Happiness. Who here thinks happiness is good? Yeah, I mean, that's pretty uncontroversial. There are people, grumpy people, maybe, who don't agree with that. But I think for the most part, you know, being happy is a good thing. Interesting question. Is life, is having your life, being in possession, being a live human being or a live anything, is that a good? It's interesting. I don't know how to answer it. Notice I put a big question mark there. That's a really interesting question. Once you're alive, you might think it's good. Oh, I'm afraid of dying. But that, I mean, but really, is it better that human beings existed than not? Or species, right? Philosophical questions about what's good. All right, what about other things that contribute to the public good? Well, we could talk about rights. Certainly, we have plenty of reason in today's world, whether you pick my country of origin or most of yours, to be concerned with rights, yeah? So freedom, is that part of something, you know, a basic to the public good? Or autonomy, right? What does autonomy mean? Is it the same thing as freedom? Slight difference. Can a philosopher in the room, if not a student, tell me the difference between freedom and autonomy? Come on. No? See, my colleagues are chickening out. All right. So, well, one way to think of freedom is being able to do stuff, right? So, if I can move my legs and arms, I'm free. Woo, right? I'm free to move around. No one's chained me down to my chair. I'm free. Well, I have freedom of movement. But don't we want something more than just to be able to move our body? What do we want? We want somehow to be the ones that determine what we do. We somehow determine our own lives. I'm not just a part of a machine that feels free. I'm not just governed by the laws of physics to do this, right? I'm not just a bunch of chemicals. I think that I make choices about who I am and what I do. That's what autonomy is. Self-determination is one way to think about the difference between freedom and autonomy. The ability to do, the ability maybe to self-determine in some sense. Dignity. Is that a good? Is that something that's part of the public good? I think so. None of us, I mean, maybe you don't know exactly what it means, but we all recognize dignity, and we really recognize, and unfortunately see too often, when someone is not given the dignity we think every human being deserves, right? That's something that we clearly care about. Independence. Clearly related to these two up here. I want to be independent. Oh, you're not my boss, right? Back to my 13-year-old. Can't tell me what to do, right? Self-determination. Again, these are all sort of related. What else? Values, right? So there's goods, and there's these other, and then there's values. Family. I think most, not all of us, but many of us value, we think there's something about a family that's intrinsically valuable. It's not just that you're all alive and you share the same house. No, it's more than that. We're family. Yeah, well, so what? I mean, he lives next door. He lives as close as your father. He's just got a room separate. No, this is my father. It's family. It's my neighbor, not family. Well, but that matters to us. Religion, obviously. Right? It's a value. It means something to us. And it's somehow, again, connected to this notion of, who we are. Look around this room when we go outside. Clearly, religion plays a role in public life in our conception of what's good. And it's also a good role and a complicating role. It doesn't make it easy, does it? Political choice. We all somehow feel, one of the things I value is that I want my vote to count. right? One of the great tragedies on the planet for so many years was that people of the wrong color or of the wrong religion or of the wrong sex or of the wrong lifestyle weren't allowed to have their vote, have a count, have a say, have matter. That matters to us. Diversity, again, related to political choice. I love teaching at AUC. And one of the reasons I love it so much is that it's all about taking all different kinds of people that aren't the same and putting them together and seeing what comes out of that. And it's not easy, and we fight and we argue and we struggle and we disagree, but it's amazing what comes from that diversity. And education, for me, in my life, it's not about my value. I value education. I don't think it's just about getting a job. If that was why I was doing it, trust me, I wouldn't be a philosopher. We don't get paid much, do we? That's not why we're doing this, is not the paycheck, right? No. To me, it's intrinsically valuable. And I think to lots of us, this is part of the public good. And isn't this something that we need as a group and that our society needs? I mean, think about one of the things that Egypt needs desperately right now, right? And maybe America as well, by the way. Yeah? So, and one thing to notice about this list is that these things are related. So certain things that we think of as goods are also values and rights. We value certain rights, right? These things are all connected. So how are we supposed to figure out how to pick among these goods, rights, and values and determine what is good for the public? Who counts as part of the public? Well, to figure out who counts as part of the public, we're going to have to go back to our list and figure out what our values are. Do we value diversity? Well, if we don't, maybe certain people aren't part of our, public. Right? And this gets very complicated very quickly, but that's okay. One thing that a philosopher cannot be afraid of is complication, complexity. Okay? Beware of someone who says otherwise. And I don't know where this expression comes from, but I think it's kind of cute. Any philosophy that can be fit into a nutshell belongs there. Right? It's not an easy, simple thing. Don't try and make it one. And this is where philosophy can, when you're confused and you're not sure, this is where philosophy can help. It can't give us an answer, but it can give us ways to think about better and worse answers. Answers that might work for us, at least help us live our lives better together. It can help us learn to listen, to think slowly and carefully, to learn from the past as we look to the future, to be respectful of answers that are different from our own, right? To be patient, to be persistent, and to keep trying. This is what philosophy teaches you. Now, for the same reason that philosophy is something that can contribute to the public good, it's also always been considered dangerous. And this is really important, and this is sort of how I want to wrap this up. Anyone know the story of Socrates? You know the name, certainly, okay? And there's this dialogue I have in my book here. I'm not going to torture you with it, called The Apology. And what happens in The Apology? What is The Apology? It's the trial of Socrates. And he's on trial for what? Corrupting the youth and making, right? Irreligion. He's a bad man, right? So here's a person who's being accused, and philosophers ever since have been accused of this. You corrupt the young people. What are you doing to my son or my daughter? Putting all these ideas in their heads. Right? You're dangerous. You're a threat to our traditions. Right? And Socrates, it's interesting. If you read The Apology carefully, he never apologizes. That is the worst transliteration of what... do you agree, by the way? That's not what it should be called, meaning-wise. He does not apologizing. This is his trial. And he's very clear. I'm not apologizing for anything. Is he a threat to society? Well, actually, yeah. Is he corrupting the youth? Maybe. Why? Because he's telling them, who should do the thinking for you? You. Think for yourself. Figure out what your values are and why how do you want to live your life? Let me ask you, sitting there in the front row, can I tell you how to live your life? Can I answer that question for you? No. And each person in this room has to answer that question for himself or herself. And that's a heavy burden. And for Socrates, that's what it was all about, working on that philosophical problem. But if he says to his young people he meets, he says, your main job in life is for you to figure out who you are and how you live your life. Do you think their fathers are going to like that very much? No. I told you to be an engineer. Right? Business admin. And that's not what philosophers do. So are philosophers dangerous? In a way. But are they necessary, and are they do they contribute to the public good? Absolutely. Are they dangerous? Yes. And that might sound like I'm teasing. I'm not. It's really important. And Socrates lived by this, and he died by it. The idea that figuring out what you think, why you think it, and living according to the values that you have your reasons for, that you earned, that's worth everything for Socrates. And so, is this part of the public good? Absolutely. I love every day, I don't get to teach enough anymore. I love going to teach. Because if I'm at all successful, one person in the room, or two people or three people in the room is going to say, I got to figure this out for myself. And that doesn't mean they ignore tradition. It doesn't mean they're mean to their parents. But it means they figure out the basic problems that matter to them themselves. Now, it might be in conversation. It might be in dialogue. Socrates talked constantly. But what was one of his most famous sayings? The only thing that I know, I don't know anything. That's provocative. That's not very good in the eyes of authority. To challenge authority. Why did he go to court? Well, ultimately he said, I figured out I didn't know anything. So I said, I know what I'm going to do. I'm going to go ask people, and I'll find someone knowledgeable. I'll find someone who really knows the truth, and then I'll be lucky. So he goes around Athens and he talks to all the rich and powerful men. And he said, there were no rich and powerful women. They were not counted as full people. We've made some progress. So he says to the rich and powerful men, hey man, you know anything about living a good life? And what does the guy say? What if you walked into a cafe here in Cairo and said that to a group of old guys? Tell me, do you know, how do you live a good life? Do you know what it means to be a good man? What do you think he would say? You. Come on, right? And then what did Socrates do? He says, okay, then tell me. He's like the little gadfly, the kid who says, why? Why? Oh, you think you know? Okay, tell me why. Why is that the right thing to do? Why is that important? Why is that valuable? Why? Why? And what happens to the old guy in the cafe? Does he like it? No. Haram! Right? This guy, I'm cool. I know I'm like the boss. I'm an authority figure. How dare you disrespect me? But what Socrates is doing is something really important, and we need to do this. I love having a 22-year-old son who tells me I'm out of touch. I need that. I need someone to tell me, old man, wake up. You don't know everything. Don't get stuck in your ways and think you know everything. That's not good for you, and it's not good for me, and it's not good for any of us. And that's what Socrates did until the day he died. So yes, it's kind of dramatic. There's no big political story I have to tell. Philosophy starts with individual people, but the public good is made of individual people. And so philosophy, I hope, is like an infection for the good, right? That we share, we talk, one person gets it, another person. We don't have to agree, but we all have to be working. That's for the public good. Now, I can stop talking because it's been an hour, or I can read for a few minutes. You want me to stop? No. Okay. I say that I talk about philosophy being a way of life. And I've talked about Socrates and how he said, one of his famous sayings, the unexamined life is not worth living. Right? Yes. Now, what's that mean for Socrates? He was told, when he was sentenced to death, he said, look, dude, just shut up. Stop asking your stupid questions and we'll let you live. Well, they didn't say it exactly like that, but that's basically what they meant. And he said no. Because if I can't engage in this activity of figuring out who I am and how I should live my life and be the best person that I can be, then my life isn't worth living. Do cows worry about how to be the best cow they can be and live a great cow life? No. And whether we like it or not, we have this blessing and this curse called self-awareness and consciousness and freedom of thought. And we have a responsibility, Socrates says, to use those. Right? You can't be a cow. You can't be a clam and just sit there and open and close and be mindless. That's not a life fit for a human being, for a person. That's a life fit for an animal. Now, I like animals, by the way. I'm not being speciesist. I'm just telling you what Socrates said. But Socrates really does think there's a special thing about being a person. And that special thing is this ability to examine your life and live your life, not someone else's version of your life. And if you give that up, your life isn't worth living. So, I want to read you a little passage here. This is from the Phaedo. And it's a long, long dialogue with lots of details. But it takes place in this room. This is his cell in prison. All right? And in the cup, you'll find out if you don't know what that is. In the cup, this is one of his jailers, this dude. And that cup right there has poison in it. And this is his moment where the death sentence is being carried out. And that's what I'm going to read to you from this. And this is, again, philosophy is a way of life and maybe a way of death. But Socrates, said Crito, I think the sun still shines on the hills and is not yet set. I know that others drink the potion quite a long time after. And, I know that they receive the order and they keep drinking and eating and they have intimacy maybe with some of their loved ones. And so you don't have to have the drink now. Take it, you can put it off. It's natural, Crito, for them to do so, said Socrates, for they think that they derive some benefit from doing this, but it is not fitting for me. I do not expect any benefit from drinking the poison a little later, except to become ridiculous in my own eyes for clinging to life and to be sparing of it when there is none left. So do as I ask, and do not refuse me. Hearing this, Crito nodded and to the slave who was standing near him, and the slave went out and after a time came back with the man who was to administer the poison, and he was carrying it ready-made in a cup. When Socrates saw him, he said, well, my good man, you are an expert at this. What must one do? Just drink it and walk around until your legs feel heavy, and then lie down, and it will act of itself. And he offered Socrates the cup, and he took it quite cheerfully, without a tremor or any change of feature, but looking at the man from under his eyebrows, as was his wont, like this. He said, what do you say about pouring a libation from this drink? Is it allowed? In other words, hey, you want to have a drink with me? We only mix as much as we believe will suffice, said the man. I understand, Socrates said, but one is allowed. Indeed, one must utter a prayer to the gods that the journey from here to yonder may be fortunate, and that is my prayer, and may it be so. Remember, he's on trial for not believing in the gods of the city, but in other new divinities. And his last act, or one of them, is to utter a prayer to the gods. And while he was saying this, he was holding the cup, and then he drained it calmly and easily. Most of us had been able to hold back our tears reasonably well until then, but when we saw him drinking it, and after he drank it, we could hold them back no longer. My own tears came in floods against my will, so I covered my face. I was weeping for myself, not for him, for my misfortune in being deprived of such a comrade. Even before me, Crito was unable to restrain his tears, and he got up. Yeah, right? They're going for it. And Apollodorus, who had not ceased from weeping before, and at this moment his noisy tears and anger made everyone present break down, except for Socrates. What is this? He said. You strange fellows, it's mainly for this reason that I sent the women away, to avoid such unseemliness. For I am told that one should die in a good omened silence. So keep quiet and control yourselves. His words made us ashamed, and we checked our tears. He walked around, and when he said his legs were heavy, he lay on his back as he had been told to do. And the man who had given him the poison touched his body, and after a while tested his feet and legs, and pressed hard upon his foot, and asked him if he felt this, and Socrates said no. And then he pressed his calves, and made his way up his body, and showed us that it was cold and stiff. He felt it himself, and said that when the cold reached his heart, he would be gone. As his belly was getting cold, Socrates uncovered his head. It had been covered until then, and said, these were his last words. Crito, we owe a cock to Asclepius. Make this offering to him, and don't forget. It shall be done, said Crito. Tell us if there is anything else. But there was no answer. Shortly afterwards, Socrates made a movement. The man uncovered him, and his eyes were fixed. Seeing this, Crito closed his mouth and his eyes. Such was the end of our comrade, a man who, we would say, was of all those we have known the best and also the wisest and the most upright. Thank you. That's sort of what I planned. But I have plenty of time. I'm here for you guys. I'm happy to answer questions. Don't be bashful. By now you know that I don't have answers, so you know, I'm not gonna have the right answer and you the wrong answer. So feel free. If any questions? Comments? Yes.
Is there a certain limit that you think beyond it philosophy is hindering your life progress?
That's a great question. Philosophy, there's been a long tradition of philosophers, I'm going to put this bluntly, and this is not the politically correct way to say it, of philosophers going nuts, going crazy. And I think you're right. I mean, I think there's two reasons for this. Part of it is because I think philosophy draws unusual people to it, right? It's not simple. It's not normal. You have to be unusual. You have to be courageous. You have to be willing to look different and have people look at you as kind of weird. You have to be interested in questions that don't seem to have any immediate practical value. You certainly can't care about being rich, right? So I think unusual people are drawn to philosophy, and maybe that's part of the story. I also think philosophy can really push you to places that some people have a hard time dealing with. And there's a long history, again, of philosophy. I mean, the most famous example, arguably one of them, is Nietzsche, who spent much of the end of his life incapacitated and not a functioning person. And philosophy, if you read his work, philosophy is torturous, joyous, but complicated and messy and sometimes really painful. So yeah, I think it's an interesting, I think it can go too far. But I think of musicians and artists and people who fall in love. I mean, all those things that are so important and valuable can go too far and have really destructive results. Any questions? That's it? I made everyone sleepy?
It's really interesting. I just feel when you were talking, I have no background about this at all. While you were talking, I was thinking that everyone is sort of a philosopher in some way. I mean, I've been doing this. We've all been thinking about things and debating it and
Right.
considering our reasons. So it's
Yeah, and one of the cool things is you're right. This stuff, the reason we keep doing it is because all of us care about it, whether we're aware of that. And all of us have been thinking about these problems. And one of the reasons I love doing philosophy and I love teaching it is that, like anything else, like music and like bike riding, if you practice it, you can get better at it. And you can learn to do it in a group. And you can learn, you know, I'm a high school dropout. I didn't finish high school. I got kicked out of my parents' house when I was 16 years old, and I was a carpenter. I built houses. And when I came to philosophy, it wasn't because someone told me to do it. And it wasn't because I wanted to make money. I had no money. It's because I thought I really loved it. And it was a kind of challenge and a kind of joy that I'd never felt before. And it was a kind of freedom. And so for me, I remember not being an academic, not being an intellectual. I haven't done this my whole life. And I remember finding out what you're saying, that sort of realization that this really matters to me and it's there in us and for all of us. And when I love teaching for the same reason, if I can, for a little bit of time for a semester with some students, have some of this, it's great. And it is for the public good.
You mentioned something about the difference between freedom and autonomy.
Yes.
And you said that autonomy is basically the freedom to self-determine.
Yeah.
But you also had self-determination.
Yes, I was redundant. I put the slides together today. No, this is, if you hadn't noticed, it's a little bit of, yeah. So, no, I don't, this is not a regular philosophy lecture. I'm not giving you some particular, this is me. So yeah, there's some redundancies in the slides for sure. Yes, please.
The methods you put after us, I didn't really feel like they were methods.
Okay, well, if you say, what did Descartes did? He sat in a chair and he thought about what he knew. Right? So he's introspecting. So he starts this exercise. He sits in a chair and he starts thinking. And then he has all these ideas and he starts thinking about them. He starts applying this method of asking, what are the reasons that I think this? Are they good? So there you have like this method of introspection and this tool, reason, applying reason, and you get results. And for Socrates, he wasn't much on introspection, I don't think. He certainly doesn't, Plato doesn't depict him that way. He thought the method was, let's talk to each, what do you think and why do you think it? Right? And one of the things that I think obvious by now, what Socrates always says, well, no, I don't care what other people said. I don't care what your father told you to say. What do you think? It's personal, right? So maybe they're not very satisfying. Again, I can't really give you a definition. If you really want to know what the methods are and what the techniques are, you got to do it, just like playing music.
I was just wondering
Yeah.
if these were just headlines.
They are just headlines. Yeah, they're just headlines. Everything up there is, and plenty of people probably in this room who would disagree with my way of putting it. It's just signposts.
It's very important.
Yes, please.
So the Socratic dialogue always ends with this aporia.
Yes.
Or in general, it's I don't know anything, right?
Aporia is the word I don't know, for those in the back. Aporia is this position that Socrates gets himself into, right? Where he says, okay, so I thought about it and I thought about it and I thought about it and I don't know.
So my question is, how this is connected to public good or my good? To just enter the state of I don't know anything, I'm always suspicious, I'm always skeptical. How this is considered good for my own good?
Okay, great question. How is it good to say, like, what the heck does it do any of us good to say, I don't know? Right? I mean, if that's all philosophy is, it doesn't seem like it's so great. But that's not all. Socrates doesn't start the conversation by saying, I don't know, and end the conversation like that. There's a process, right? And I think that's why I talk about philosophy as a way of life and engaging in an activity. It's okay if, and one weird way of putting this is that the philosopher starts and finishes at exactly the same place and nothing changes. Right? You don't, in one sense, know any more than you did when you began. And yet everything changes because you've looked at what you're thinking and why you're thinking it. So you might end up thinking the same thing after that. But now you know why you think it. You have a better relationship to what you are thinking, what you're caring about, right? So you're right. I still am not sure about a lot of the things that, at the end of the day in my philosophy, I don't know. I still can't tell you why I think virtue ethics is the right answer in terms of ethical theories. I mean, I could give you all kinds of theoretical answers, but a good utilitarian could swat me around and we wouldn't agree. But my thinking about those problems changes my life, changes the way I think about when I talk to my Boab and when I'm in class with my students and when I'm thinking about going to see my children. Tomorrow we're getting on a plane to New York City, woo, right? all of that, in a weird way, is affected by this process, this activity, even though I don't get an answer. And by the way, the aporia and that not getting an answer, I always understand when halfway through the semester, a student says to me, "Doctor, are we really not going to learn anything? I really don't think this is a very useful class, doctor." I understand. It is frustrating. It takes a certain kind of personality, just like with sports and music. Not everyone loves it. Not everyone's made to do philosophy. But most of us have some of it inside of us. Yes? Oh, wait, I have someone in the back who hasn't talked yet, I think. I'll come back to you. Yes?
Who can decide what's the public good? I mean, the majority or someone who is in power?
Well, that's a great question. And what we would have to do to answer that question is figure out what the public good is, right? We still haven't answered that question. And then we'd have to figure out, okay, well, is the majority way to make decisions? Because in that case, women should run the world. Easy, no problem, right? If we start using majorities, that would immediately change things. Or what, I mean...
There is tribes who are cannibals. There is tribes who are cannibals.
Right.
Cannibal tribes, and they eat people.
Right.
And
So,
the majority accepts that, so that's not public good, I think.
well, that's, again, so one of the great things, one of the reasons you might say that philosophy keeps coming back to us is because we have to solve these really important problems that science can't answer for us and no list of facts can answer for us. What do you do when you meet someone and you have to live and work with someone who has values that you think are fundamentally wrong? Guess what? That's life. Come on, think about the things that we see in the news, right? Whatever side of the news you're on. So one of the philosophical challenges, I can't give you the answer, but I think it's really good for all of us to learn how to ask the questions and have a conversation that isn't yelling and isn't killing each other. Instead, it's a giving of reasons, trying to find places where we actually, I mean, me and cannibals, we probably both love our families. Okay, so it's actually, they got this crazy eating people thing, but mostly we're similar. So then I could figure out how I could make it work a little, right? So that's what you have to do, and philosophy allows you to do that. It's not going to solve the problem for you, but it'll help you, and it'll help us try and work on the problems, and not just scream at each other and kill each other. Yes, please.
Does humanity deserve good? Let's say hypothetically that we determine what's moral good. Why should we work on it?
Yeah.
Why should we achieve it? Do we deserve it?
Yeah.
Does humanity deserve it?
Right. That's a great question. And again, it's a deep philosophical question, which means there's no easy answer to it. There's two ways that you can respond to the question you just asked. You can just say, "Ah!" and leave. No, really. Or you can say, all right, wow, that's a kill. I'm not going to be able to sleep until I figure out something to think about that, do something with this question. So then maybe I'd start reading books or talking to people who've read books, philosophers, philosophy professors, other smart students, other people who aren't students, older folks, younger folks, and try and figure out, right? And this is why you do philosophy. I'm not going to give you an answer. But if right now, you just don't even know what to say, right? Maybe you have faith, but beyond that, I can't really give a good answer. I don't have a definite answer, but I've learned over 50 years and 30 years of philosophy that I can have ways of thinking about that question that I can, at least most nights, I can go to sleep, right? It's not a solution. But that exercise of trying to answer that question, I think it's good for you, and I think it's good for us. I could be wrong, of course. Yes, please.
Well, it's kind of a response to the first two questions.
Uh-huh.
The second one first. How can we progress to the question of is philosophy good for is philosophy important for the public good? We haven't yet defined the public good and philosophy, or should the majority define public good? We might spend hours arguing about it, and then we discover that we mean different things by public good.
Yeah.
The second one is the first question actually. Is it good to not know anything? Maybe it is. So if I have an answer, right, maybe that's right and maybe that's wrong. So when I say that I don't know, I go into a new state. So if I find out that my answer is wrong, then it's better that I don't know the answer than knowing a wrong answer. Is that better? I don't know. We have to agree on that also.
Well, that's a great question. Okay, I'll start with the second one, then I'll go back to the first question about language.
And if you have the right answer before we know why we do it, then after going through the I don't know state, then maybe we could go back to the right answer.
But that's what Descartes does, right? I mean, Descartes says, I want to know, I see everything in the world around me, and I want to know if I can trust it. And after all 6 meditations, he's back in the same world that he began in, but he has a whole new sense of reality, right? So, is not knowing good, right? How is ignorance a blessing? Well, one way to think of it is this, and I sometimes talk about this. I don't have a whiteboard. I wish I had a blackboard or a whiteboard here. One way to think, what? Yeah, but I don't, do we have a, nah, I can do it. I can just use my hands. Well, one way to think about ignorance is this. Okay, so there's knowing nothing. That's what Socrates says. He says, I know nothing. I'm right here. I know that I know nothing. So I know one thing. Okay, now most people, where are they compared to Socrates? They're worse off. They don't know that they don't know. So you're right to say, well, what's so great about not knowing anything? That's fine. You could be worse off. Another interesting way to think of this is, well, how would you get above not knowing anything? That's a good question. You should ask. That'll make your life better. You might not get the right answer. You might not get, but that's a question worth asking. Right? I mean, if someone says, well, you know, can you be perfect in the eyes of God? No, right? Should you try your best? Yeah. Okay, so am I ever going to know? And everybody said, no. Should I try? Yeah. Same kind of answer to me. Now, the other question you asked was about, well, we don't know what we mean by the words, so how can we know what we're talking about until we get the words right? I mean, you say mean one thing, I mean another, you know? Potato, patata, tomato, tomato, right? That's a very good question. And for that reason, there's a long history, again going back thousands of years, where one of the ways to think about what philosophy is to say, the problem is we don't know what the heck we're talking about. So what we need to do is just get our words organized. And if we did that, all of this philosophical chaos would fall away. And it would be like having a mathematical proof. And what I would say would come out like a mathematical proof and fall, and you'd go, ah. And we'd be talking in the same language and mean exactly the same thing. So I talked about Wittgenstein and Bertrand Russell. I mentioned his. They were people in the first half of the 20th century who were involved in this era in Britain mostly, where they really believed that you could just get the language right. All that philosophy, chaos and confusion, I don't know, Socrates, that would all disappear. They were wrong. And part of the reason they're wrong is they came to realize, like, yeah, you want to have a final answer, you want the ultimate proof, but just like Descartes found, there's always something underneath, another question you can ask. And philosophy of language has the same problem. You can keep trying to define and define and define, and you'll never be finished. So, like all other philosophical methods and tools, definitely work on getting your language better. That's one of the things we're constantly doing. When you grade a paper, right? This is unclear. Please explain more fully. Give me the reasons for saying this, right? That's awesome. So yeah, get your language precise, but it's not going to end philosophy. Yeah, in the back.
Yeah, we talked about getting a base that's really solid.
Uh-huh.
But while building, do you need faith to hold the blocks together, or you can build one building without faith?
That's a great question. I'm not even going to begin to try and answer it. Like a lot of the things I've been saying, you can't hide from the fact that philosophy is a tradition with a history. And there's a lot of brilliant people who are a lot smarter than I am, who've thought exactly your question and said, what's faith's role in this? And there's a lot of different answers, so I'm not even going to try and tell you. I mean, Descartes, depending on how you interpret him, right now there are people writing books and articles saying Descartes didn't really believe in God. He didn't really need faith. He just said that so he didn't get in trouble. That's one group. And then there's a whole other group of people who say, come on, get off it. He obviously is a believer. This is a construct that God is essential to. You cannot have any knowledge without knowing that God exists. And they're still having that argument. So, I mean, I certainly couldn't answer the question for you. I don't know whether you could answer it for yourself, but if you did, I think there'd be a lot of reading to do. It's a great question. Yeah. Yes, ma'am. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But we both try to answer the same question using radically different methods.
Mm-hmm.
One of them uses the mind, and the other uses, the divine.
Mm-hmm.
Creates an image of the divine who is all-knowing and who communicates to us and gives us some really deep knowledge
Mm-hmm.
without us having to think of it.
Right.
Now, how does that not collide with philosophers having to think for themselves? How does that not collide with this?
Okay.
And another question,
Yes, okay.
if we both can answer the same stuff, why can't one of them completely replace the other?
Great. Okay. Why not one? So, again, one of the ways to answer your question is I do think it's a new invention for the most part. I mean, there have been exceptions, but for most of the history of philosophy, philosophers have been believers, right? And so most philosophers in the history of philosophy, in one way or another, would say that their religious beliefs are one way of making sense of the world. And it's useful and important and essential maybe to who their identity and their values and everything about who they are. But it's only one part of who they are and only one way of knowing the world. Another way to look at the same world is using reason. And it's not obvious to me now it seems like they have to be in conflict. But it's not actually true. I mean, you can reach the same conclusion. Isaac Newton. The famous Isaac Newton? Do you know whether or not he was a believer? Yeah, and what did he say he was doing when he was doing science? Yeah, God's creation, this beautiful, magisterial, mechanically spectacular achievement that reveals God's perfection, and science, the application of reason to nature. Exactly the same. There's no conflict. They're supporting each other. They can, but they don't always. That's the point. It's not something that necessarily happens. And I think one of the mistakes of nowadays is to think, oh, no matter what, the second you start using reason, you're an atheist. That's just not, come on. Right? And there, again, one of the things that's helpful in a modern perspective where we think we know religion over here, philosophy over here, don't get them in the same room, you get in trouble. That's just not the way it's been. Okay, well, what do we do if you and I both care about something and we don't have the same answer, right? We don't make the same decision. What do we do? Yeah.
But I'm the same person.
But I have lots of things. Are you totally consistent in everything you think and believe and you're at peace with yourself 24/7? No. It's part of being a person, right? So faith is really demanding and really difficult and essential to who you are and making sense of the world. But you're also, that thing. You're not an animal, right? Like Socrates said, you're a thinking thing. Or Descartes said you're a thinking thing, right? Socrates too. So those things coexist in you. And you struggle. And sometimes they support each other. Sometimes they fight each other. Well, so your appetite, right? You want to stay slim and buff, right? But you also are hungry and want to eat, right? Life is part of human nature is that struggle. And I think it's okay. For me at least, I don't think it's dangerous to faith to use God's gift of reason. Is that, so, and then you asked another question about why don't you pick one? I sort of just answered it. If you have two ways of making sense of something that serve needs that you have, why would you throw one away? If using philosophy and reason can get us together in a room with people that don't agree and don't have the same faith and allow us to cooperate in certain ways and share reasons, that's a useful, good thing. And then you also need God and your relationship to God to make sense of the world. That's a good thing too. Why throw one of them away? Yes, I have to.
I just want to ask you to elaborate on the value of the question. You have a lot of questions being asked that want an answer.
Right.
The essence of philosophy is so much about the question,
Mm-hmm.
and that you're not an atheist if you ask questions about
Right.
God, and it's important to faith to ask those questions
Mm-hmm.
and not believe without wondering about them, and they don't necessarily conflict by having
Right.
just the idea of the question.
Yeah. Well, one of the things, right, philosophy is the asking of questions and the giving of reasons, right? And so you can't do philosophy without the questions. And arguably what philosophy is constantly trying to figure out the question, trying to sharpen, get the language of the question right so that you know what you're saying and how you're saying it. The question drives everything. And getting the question right is going to determine how you think about going for an answer. So yes, it's essential. It's always there. Yes, finally, the wallflower.
I mean, I would kind of say, it's just important to remember that a lot of the time, what a religious philosopher is doing when they're doing philosophy is trying to make their reason and their faith come together. So if
Yeah.
you ask, what happens when reason and faith conflict, I think most philosophers who are religious would say, you're not done yet. You have to keep thinking until you can find some way to fit your thoughts together with your
Yeah. I mean, I remember asking that question when I was first teaching at a Jesuit university in America, and the guy said, well, yeah, if you get a conflict of almost the same exact thing, if you get a conflict of philosophy, of reason giving and faith, then you're doing something wrong because, God gave you that reason, and if you use it well, that gift. So keep working, keep trying, keep applying, instead of just defeat and say, oh, I got to pick one or the other, I'm doomed.
Philosophy and science should assume no final answers. It should start from the point where I don't have any ready-made answers and keep them until I'm sure of what I have. It shouldn't be trying to reach some particular end.
Well, I know the thing is, though, this is an interesting question. How practical does science or philosophy have to be? Because if you did science and it got you nothing, and if you did philosophy and all you ever said was, I don't know, and you didn't benefit from either activity, science or philosophy wouldn't be of much good. So what's interesting about is trying to figure out what are the goods that we get from science. Maybe some of them are public goods, right? And what are the goods that we get from philosophy? There's been a very patient person in the back. Yeah. Please.
So remember, I leave from the sociology department, and so I want to just add a sociological component in support of this, of the whole philosophy phenomenon. Just remembering in the context of the past 60 years, the idea of philosophy has been marginalized. And in the 1950s, it was pushed out in favor of engineering and the art sciences because we don't need things. There's no offense to the music, no offense. The phenomenon really starts there. So we have this expression developed in the same called such a don't philosophize only. And this has always given a stigma to philosophy, which is anything out of the world. And this comes under what I call, what we have accepted disciplines and suspected disciplines. When you introduce yourself as an engineer, no one questions. They might say, okay, mechanical or architecture, at most. But if you say philosophy, then that opens up Pandora's box. Or political science, you might be asked, how are you going to get married? Or how are you going to find what's that?
The other word.
What is
the other word? Nonsense question.
nonsense, exactly, etc. And then the sarcasm comes.
Yeah.
There's a lot of sarcasm.
Yeah.
And so, as a result, we have an imagination crisis on every level of society. And I think we've learned since 2011 that philosophers have come back in vogue. I've seen there's a reading culture that's growing in Alexandria, Cairo, especially. And there's some good steps towards philosophy happening. turn down the music, but I ask, why is the music on? And then he or she doesn't know. It's just